So I want to thank everybody for joining us. My name is Stephanie, and I'm with the Spina Bifida Mid-Atlantic Region chapter. And tonight we're going to have Rachel from the Disability Law Center of Virginia host this wonderful workshop for the accommodations for employment and public places. And we're going to touch on a bit of assistive technology as well. If you have any questions, we're going to do a Q&A after each section, and you can do anything in the chat box as well if you have a quick question. Just ask that you guys mute, and I'll let Rachel go ahead and take it away. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you guys for having me. I'm going to start just as a brief introduction to myself. I thought I would do this at the end, but I guess I'll do this at the beginning. My name is Rachel Loria. I am I'm a professional in the disability field. I've been at the Protection and Advocacy Office for 6 years. I typically focus on assistive technology for students in school, assistive technology for adults at work, vocational rehabilitation for students in high school and also within the Department of Juvenile Justice, and vocational rehabilitation for adults. And I do a little bit of work in the realm of rep payee, kind of working with Social Security Administration to look at different rep payee providers and kind of analyze their documents to make sure that they're compliant. And I also do a lot of assistive technology work for my office. I started in this field probably about more than 10 years ago, because I am a self-advocate. I was born with a neurological disability that sometimes makes it so that I need a little bit more comprehension time. It also affects the way I walk and the way I move sometimes. It's never been diagnosed. It's been tested and tested and tested and retested and never quite diagnosed, which I think a lot of people within the disability community can understand. And then in 2016, I had a traumatic brain injury, which also led to understanding the disability world a little bit more. So tonight I'm going to be talking a little bit about the Americans with Disabilities Act. I'm also going to be talking a little bit about vocational rehabilitation, and then we'll wrap it up with a little bit of information about assistive technology. And midway through, we do have a video that's about 10 minutes, which is a review of some of the ADA stuff that we speak about, but it's also closed captioned so that if you need the link later, it is closed captioned and will be accessible to anyone who needs it. So I'm going to go ahead and share screen, full screen. On the beginning. Let's go. Okay, so just a little bit of a legal disclaimer before I start. That this presentation is designed to give general legal information, not intended to provide any legal advice. I am not a lawyer, I'm an advocate. So just by this presentation doesn't create any kind of attorney-client relationship with the Disability Law Center of Virginia. So what is the Disability Law Center of Virginia? Well, we are the protection and advocacy system in Virginia. We started in 1975 because of all of the abuse that was happening at the Willowbrook Mental Institution. If you haven't seen a lot of the documents and documentary about Willowbrook, I really encourage people to watch it. It is tough to see, but it's good to at least get a glimpse of some of the history. We protect the civil rights of people with disabilities throughout the state of Virginia by monitoring and investigation of health and safety. We monitor a lot of different state hospitals and also group homes to make sure that people are not being abused or neglected. We also monitor, we advocate for free and appropriate public education, and if parents fear that that's not happening, they are always welcome to call Disability Law Center of Virginia and speak with us about it. And we aim to change the system when we can. And I'll speak a little bit more about that towards the end of the presentation if we have time. So let's start with what the Americans with Disabilities Act actually is. is an act to protect people with disabilities. It was established July 26th of 1990 with the famous words of "Let the shameful wall of exclusion finally come tumbling down." We celebrated the 30th anniversary of the ADA this week, and I'm going to go through some really basic information about the ADA. So let's start with what a disability is. The term disability can be a physical or mental impairment that limits one or more major life functions. When we talk about life functions, we include usually 5 or 6 areas of independent living, communication, mobility, self decision making, and self-care. So the Americans with Disabilities Act is meant to prohibit discrimination against people with disabilities in all areas of life. We know that there's still a lot of work to do, but its goal is to prohibit discrimination in all areas of life, like jobs, schools, transportation, and all other public and private places that are open to the public. There's 5 separate clauses. We're going to focus heavily on the first 3 and focus a little bit on the last 2. So Title I of the ADA is employment. The first major thing to think about when you are looking at employment is disclosure. I work a lot with high school students, and we focus on disclosure a lot. We talk about what is meant, what it means to disclose your disability, and if you have to disclose your disability if it's not already visible, because it's not legally, you're never legally mandated to disclose your disability, and you can't be retaliated against because of your disability. It's important that you understand that sometimes when you're asking for accommodations, that your employer does have to know about a disability in order to provide reasonable accommodations, which gets us to a little bit about what a reasonable accommodation is. In order to be eligible for a job, you have to be able to fulfill the minimum functions of that job, with or without accommodations. Accommodations can be, are usually determined as reasonable or unreasonable by the employer, and that's important to understand. Examples of reasonable accommodations can include an adjusted work schedule. They can include sometimes working from home. They can include having a private workspace instead of working in a larger room with other people. They can include sometimes, I have a coworker who has Medicaid pay for someone to come and help her use the restroom and other things during her lunch break. That can be a reasonable accommodation. Reasonable accommodations can also include having things that you do for yourself. I color code my own schedules, and that's a reasonable accommodation that I provide, that I use my work time to do. They can also include, when I had my traumatic brain injury, I asked to be able to use my own car instead of a rental car when I'm traveling, but to be paid the higher rate for the rental car. That was approved as a reasonable accommodation. When people are asking for accommodations at work, we always encourage them to provide any kind of medical documentation that they have, describing why the accommodation is necessary and what can be done with that accommodation. Don't just go to an employer and say, I have autism and I need my own workspace. Go to your employer or to your HR department with the letter from your doctor describing why you need your own workspace and how it benefits them as a company and makes you more efficient. So in terms of what an employer can ask for, they can ask for medical documents and medical records as long as they are asking everyone else for those documents. They cannot ask you for something different that they don't ask other people for. So what if you get discriminated against? What if while you're working, you get discriminated against at your workplace based on your disability? If you think you've been discriminated based on your disability, you can always reach out to the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission. This is another part of Title I, and it gives you a complaint mechanism if you feel that you have been discriminated against. If you work for the state, there's a different process, and I've included both links so that you can go to whichever one you feel fits your situation. So for Title II is reasonable accommodations in state buildings, in government buildings. This can also include public transportation, which I know in Richmond, where I am, is a big issue. Examples of government buildings can be places like post offices, can also be schools. It can also be colleges. It can also be non-buildings. It could be bus systems. We have an individual who during the coronavirus here, they've been asked to load the bus from the back and not from the front. And we had an individual call us who told us that he asked for reasonable accommodation to load the bus from the front, and he was denied that accommodation. And we were able to help him figure out how to file the Title II complaint. A lot of the time, reasonable accommodation is also required under Title II, and it's up to the person. It's not up to the person who's requesting to determine whether it's reasonable. Unfortunately, I wish it were that case, but it's usually up to the person that's being asked. However, if they say, oh, our building is one thing that we hear in Virginia a lot is, oh, our building's too old. Grandfather clause, it doesn't apply. Even many different historical sites will say that. There is no grandfather clause in the ADA. What they're usually talking about is undue hardship, that it might cost too much. So that's something that you have to come up with options and figure out what options would work for them. They have to provide you some kind of reasonable accommodation. An example of some Title II, our work is different every single year, but an example of some Title II work that we did was I had an individual who needed an interpreter at the Social Security Administration. And she called because she couldn't get an interpreter. And we worked with her to schedule an appointment and to make sure that there was some kind of effective communication provided. At the end, it was not an interpreter, but she was fine with somebody writing down the information for her as she was up at the counter. And that worked for her, and that's what we advocated for. But understand that when I say tips, a lot of the time, if you need an interpreter or something, we always recommend you call ahead and let them know that, because they are mandated to give you an interpreter or some kind of effective means of communication. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in Title III, but you also have to request that accommodation. They're not going to know right off the bat that you need that accommodation. So for Title III, it's private places that are open to the public. What I mean by that are restaurants, grocery stores, doctor's offices. Most of the time when we hear complaints about ADA and places not being accessible, it's Title III. So we talk about, in Title III, we talk about effective means of communication when you're at the medical offices. Medical offices have to provide for the interpreter. That is not a cost that the individual has to take on. That's something that the medical office needs to pay for. They have to pay for some kind of effective communication for you. Same with Title II, person is still required a reasonable accommodation. One example is parking lots at grocery stores that don't have enough accessible spots. We have dealt with this a lot, where we have worked a case and written to the grocery store, written them a letter of concern, shown them the requirement, shown them in what we call the ADAG, which is the Design Guidelines for the Americans with Disabilities Act, Design and Accessibility Guidelines. we've shown them where it states that they have to have certain requirements, and they've called us back or emailed us back or written to us and said, here, look, we fixed it. And that's been successful on our part. So we always encourage people to give us a call if a place is not accessible. And sometimes we can provide some insight or some guidance, or in some cases, advocacy in order to make that happen. So Title IV is about, I took a little bit from Title IV and V to describe a little bit of some of what is in those. Title IV, what we hear most often is telephone and television access for people with disabilities. There has to be a relay service or Sorensen. Televisions have to have captions, or the stations have to enable captions so that people can have equal opportunity to enjoy entertainment or have the information that they need. And if there's any issue with those, or if you need any more guidance on those, you can always contact the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, and I've included contact information for them. So for Title IV, I've included a little bit about the Telecommunication Act, which makes it so that people who make telecommunication equipment have to make sure that it's accessible to people with disabilities. So for Title V, the biggest thing that we hear about is the retaliation against not people with disabilities, but people who are associated with people with disabilities. We have parents who call who said, you know, they're retaliating against me at work because my child has a disability and I need to take time off for my child. We've talked a lot about people who are at work and see people with disabilities being discriminated against at work and speak out about it, and get retaliated against for speaking out about it, and that can also sometimes fall into Title V. So now we're going to go into a couple of really specific requirements for Title II and Title III. So for parking, there are certain, if the first graphic is showing the number of parking spots in the lot to the number of required accessible spaces.
So I had one question while we're talking. And it brings up just the advances that 2020 and just the new century, a lot of things are Netflix, Hulu, Amazon TV.
Yeah.
Does Title IV fall into that as well? Are they considered TV providers, although they're...
So it's interesting that you should mention that. I always, I would consider it in there, but like I said, I'm not a lawyer. I'm an advocate. But I was actually speaking with somebody a couple of weeks ago about how it's not even closed captions. It was, this individual could not see or hear. No, she could hear but not see. So they were asking about those visual descriptions, where some of the TV stations now have, where they're like describing the picture. I would think that it would fall into Title IV, yes.
Okay. Yeah, there's just so many, I mean.
There's a lot, and like, a lot of something, sometimes even I have to make sure before I show a video during a presentation that that closed captions is enabled, because it's a lot to think about sometimes. A lot of the time with, and not just to make sure they're enabled, but to make sure they're accurate. Because often they can be enabled but not accurate. So in every parking lot, if it has a certain amount of spaces, it also has to include a certain amount of accessible spaces. Signage has to have the symbol for accessibility. Now, recently, it also has to state that any violators will be towed at the owner's expense. They have to be the spots that are closest to the door. And I'm not sure. I know that there's a requirement for a certain number of van spots, so wider spots, and I do not think that that's included in that minimum number of accessible spaces. There also has to be an access aisle that's 5 feet, and the length has to be obviously the length of the car. So if you are parking in a garage, the accessible spaces, including van spaces, have to be spread out, but they also have to provide the same protection and security as other places in the garage. If it is the garage that is serving multiple places and not just one place, they are allowed to have all of the accessible spaces on one level. This is all information that I've taken from the ADAG, the ADA design guidelines, and I can send that link out after the presentation as well. This is a little bit more information. Was that somebody speaking up? Was that me? Okay, I guess that was me. This is a little bit more information about the length of the parking spaces and the vehicle spaces. So it has to be a minimum of 96 inches and it has to be the full length of the parking space. And like we said earlier, has to be the closest to the door. And it also has to be a clear walkway to the door, which is, as I know, we monitor voting accessibility as well. And that's something that we always are looking for to make sure that it is unobstructed you guys hear the door. So for entrances, 60% of the public entrances on new construction have to be accessible. It has to have the accessible sign and show you where the accessible entrance is if that entrance is not accessible. So we're looking a little bit further in, and the door weight has to be 5 pounds maximum. And there are tools that you can get on Amazon to test door weight. You have to be able to open it with a closed hand. So for also smooth surface, it has to have enough room for you to be able to get in, and you have to have that clearance. But one thing that's interesting is many people think that the buttons that you push to get into, that the push buttons have to be there, and they do not, as long as they meet these other requirements. So for curb cuts, this is another lovely thing that we come up with a lot. Curb cuts, a lot of the time when we see curb cuts, the slope is too high. So they have to basically be a certain slope. So when you're in the restroom, there has to be clear floor space, obviously, so that you don't get tripped up when you're trying to use the restroom. You have to have the height of the stall has to be correct. You have to have grab bars at certain heights so that they fit, so that they are accessible for people with disabilities. And right now, I'm going to try to show you, we have a video that talks about a lot more of the requirements.
It may surprise you that only 30 years ago, many of the buildings where you visit or work were completely inaccessible to people with disabilities. With a great deal of effort and commitment, people with disabilities organized and forced America to pay attention to building access. Since first signed into law in 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act has made sweeping changes to American buildings, structures, and accessways. There are a stunning number of details in the ADA and its revisions. Feel free to look through all of the requirements at the website www.access-board.gov, We would like to show you some of the basic parts of the ADA that you may see in your own day-to-day journey through life. Remember that the ADA is an important part of the legacy and history of people with disabilities.
Today, almost all government-owned or public buildings are ADA compliant, which means they are accessible to most people with mobility, vision, or hearing disabilities. Most aspects of the entrances, exits, and interiors meet guidelines that allow people to navigate. Let's start with the first area you will encounter when visiting a public building, the parking lot. There will be a specified number of parking spots and van spaces for people with disabilities. The number of those spaces depends on the total spaces allocated for that building. For example, if there are 100 to 150 total parking spaces, the law requires allocation of 5 standard accessible spots and 1 van accessible spot for people with disabilities. The surface must be concrete or asphalt. There must also be a clear access route and signs indicating parking spots and signs to the door or entrance you will use. The surface must be hard and free of debris or deterioration. Curb cuts and curb ramps that bring a person from street level to sidewalk level come in a variety of shapes and sizes. The requirement for new construction is a ramp that is 12 inches long for every 1 inch rise in sidewalk height, or a slope of 1 to 12, accessing a sidewalk that is a minimum of 4 feet wide. In your personal travels, you will undoubtedly come across curb cuts that do not meet the 1 to 12 slope requirement. These may be older buildings and sidewalks, and the curb cut is an add-on. They may be steep and difficult to negotiate.
Let's go in. At many buildings these days, access is pretty straightforward. At the main entrance, you push the blue panel and voila, the door opens. At times, you may not be using the main entrance. You might be going to a security area for clearance or to a historical building with a side entrance and a manually opening door. In an industrial or commercial setting, there must be signs indicating where you enter. There has to be a ramp to the door if it is elevated in any way. The door has to have a handle, not a knob, and the door has to open with a mere 5 pounds of force, which is very easy. The door handle can be no higher than 48 inches and no lower than 36 inches. As you would expect and hope, the floor has to be hard and smooth, with plenty of room to maneuver. You made it inside. Good job. Here, we like to see smooth floors, plenty of light, no protruding obstacles, and plenty of room to maneuver. Many inside doors will have the same requirements as exterior doors. There must be 32 inches from the door to the other side of the door frame. Any door that opens automatically needs to swing open outside of the clear space next to the open panel.
Any door that opens to face another door must allow one door to close before opening the other door. This space is 48 inches from the end of the open door to the front of the next door. Again, this is called turning space. Floor and ground surfaces are another building block in the ADA. Accessible floor and ground surfaces must be stable, firm, and slip resistant. Carpeting needs to be a maximum of 1/2 inch total, including the pile and backing. Any mats must have a stiff backing to avoid rolling or bunching. In a corridor, nothing but a handrail may protrude from the wall more than 4 inches. A handrail may protrude 4.5 inches. Phones, charging stations, trash receptacles, and drinking fountains need to be placed in a recessed area so they will not protrude more than 4 inches into the corridor. The lowest point of any mounted object must be a maximum 27 inches from the floor. This allows detection of the object with a cane sweep. This also allows the knees of a person in a wheelchair to fit under the object.
If you ride the elevator, a sliding single door needs to be at least 36 inches wide. A double sliding door needs to be at least 42 inches wide. The smallest elevator allowed is 68 inches wide by 51 inches deep. That is a small space if you're in a wheelchair. Elevator doors must remain open for at least 3 seconds. The floor must comply to same standards as hallway floors. The lighting must be at least 5-foot candles, which should be plenty of light. All of the previous requirements apply to public restrooms. The door must be easy to open with 5 pounds of push maximum. The floor must be hard and free of obstacles and must open allowing for adequate turning space. Stall doors usually open outward, but are allowed to open inward and intrude on the turning space as long as there is enough space to maneuver. Sinks need to be wheelchair accessible. There are many buildings that are covered by the ADA requirements, including restaurants, hotels, recreation facilities, and stores. For example, when you visit a museum or go out to eat, you can expect the same accommodations as in a public building. There are some exceptions, namely historic buildings, where it would be too expensive to make alterations or the alterations might change the historic aspect of the building. Another exception are churches, houses of worship, and private clubs. Although areas of worship are not required to follow the ADA accessibility rules, many do anyway, as a courtesy to their patrons. dLCV is currently involved in studying the accessibility of public transportation pickup and drop-off locations. The Federal Department of Transportation issues guidelines for public transportation vehicles. In short, in a wheelchair, you should be able to get to the bus, get on the bus, and navigate inside the bus without hindrance. Not all public transportation services are alike, and there are still many issues with bus stops, available seating, signage, and announcements in train stations, and just plain civility. As you travel in your community, keep an eye out for issues and report them to the dLCV. dLCV is also actively gathering data about access to places where you vote. Polling places are schools, places of worship, sometimes a post office, and even non-public buildings. Law requires that all voting spaces have full access to the voting machines and adhere to ADA specifications. Access ways, easy-to-open doors, turning space, and non-protruding objects should all be ADA compliant. Each location should have curbside voting, an access voting machine with staff trained to use it. dLCV discovered many polling locations are not accessible and is making the appropriate reports. When you vote, make notes about what you see and contribute your information to the dLCV database.
There is a great deal of history behind people with disabilities. As you travel through your area, going to work, visiting a friend, or going on vacation, remember that many people had to advocate strenuously to change the laws and gain accessibility to buildings, transportation areas, and voting areas. Now it is your turn. Work with your neighbors and your community. Look for issues and problems and then help find ways to make the situation better. It is your responsibility, your legacy, and your future.
And that voting rights part is very important because it is something that we do with every single election. We go to voting places, we make sure that it's accessible, and we make sure that people have curbside voting available. That is for, at least for Virginia. If there is if you're not in Virginia, if you're coming to us from a different state tonight, there is a protection and advocacy office in your state too. And that also has voting. I think all of them do voting issues. So is there any questions on accessibility before we move to Voc Rehab?
Well, I'm thinking about voting, and
Okay.
there's, talk of mail-in ballots and things like that, and the absentee. Are those provided in Braille as well?
Funny you should mention that. The LCV actually just um, basically put the state on blast this week because the mail-in ballot, we want more efforts to make the mail-in ballots accessible to people with disabilities.
Okay.
And I know a lot of other states have been doing that as well. I think North Carolina did. I'm not sure about other states, but they should be accessible. If you have a mail-in ballot, it should be accessible to you as well. So if you're in Virginia and you want to vote by mail, give us a call. I've got our contact information at the very end. We're always looking to exercise some of our voting stuff.
I have a question
Sure.
about parking.
Yes.
I work for the federal government, and
Okay.
we're all teleworking now, so it's not an issue now. But I ran into some very significant issues with parking. I drive, and I had a lot of trouble with accessible parking. And
At your office or at places that you visit?
at my
for work?
office. At my
Okay.
office, I ran it. The situation was such that, and I know this is complicated, but I just want to,
Absolutely.
the issue I ran into was that it was a public parking garage that the agency paid for some spaces in. So some of it, people off the street could come in and park, and some of it was reserved for people who worked in the building. And among one of the issues I faced was that I would get in at 7 o'clock in the morning, and all 8 handicap parking spaces would be full.
Work on, and they'd say, oh, all we have to do is provide the spaces.
Yes.
Are you in Virginia or are you in a different state?
I live in Virginia, but the office was in DC.
Okay, that would be, because it occurred in DC, that would definitely be something to reach out to the DC Protection and Advocacy Office about.
Okay.
I don't know if they're doing, you said government, so I'm thinking Title II. If they're doing Title II, but it would be something to reach out to them about. And
So you think it would be covered under Title II?
I think it would be.
Okay.
I would definitely be something to call them about, and they can, if they can't help advocate for you directly, they may be able to help you figure out what the next resource would be in terms of filing a complaint if you need to.
Thank you.
Okay, so not hearing any other questions, I think I'm going to carry on to Voc Rehab. But first, I'm going to screen share. So another area that dLCV works in through our client assistance program is vocational rehabilitation. So let's start with, what is vocational rehabilitation? Vocational rehabilitation services are services provided by either the Department of Aging and Rehabilitative Services, DARS, or the Department for the Blind and Vision Impaired, DBVI. The services are either provided by them, or they pay other, what we call EOs or ESOs to provide those services. So the locations for those is, there should be a DARS or DBVI office in every part of the state. So the part that is closest to you is where your local office would be. And I've got, later on, I've got a map that shows, or a link that will show you where each office is. So to be eligible for DARS or DBVI services, you have to have a disability, and it has to affect your ability to get, keep, or progress, meaning to move up in a job. Other eligibility questions regarding funding or eligibility for services, we encourage people to talk with their counselors and ask them questions about funding. If you speak with your counselor and have any issues with services from them, we are always available to answer questions. So types of services that might be included by DARS or DBVI. They can help with things like interview skills. They can help you to prepare for a job or to apply for a job. That's often their job club, where they have people who are looking for work come together once a week where they talk about job leads and speak about employment skills. They can help you learn skills that are required for jobs. They can provide what's called pre-employment transition services, which we're going to talk about in just a minute. They can sometimes provide financial assistance for things like assistive technology, which we're going to talk about at the end of the presentation. They can also provide sometimes financial assistance for education. That's always something you can talk with your DARS or DBVI counselor about, as long as it relates to your work goal. They can also sometimes provide job support. And so what I mean when I say job support is that DARS or DBVI can sometimes have a support person come with you as you're learning a job. That support person will help you with a task, and they will basically work themselves out of a job. They will work with you until they are no longer needed. And the individual can speak if you're interested in that type of thing, or family members interested in that type of thing. You can talk with DARS about how long a support person can be in place, or how long they can stay at the job. So I mentioned pre-employment transition services, and I always speak about this a little bit because it's one of the things I focus on, but it's also something that is not often known about. So pre-employment transition services, or as we call them, PREETs, can start as early as age 14. Will always start in high school. The services can either occur in school or they can occur in the community. There's 5 core services included, and I'm going to talk about each one for just a minute. So the first one is work-based learning experiences. This can be trying out different jobs that might be of interest. It can be seeing what day-to-day life looks like at each job, and it can also include learning on the job. I think I skipped one. I didn't. Okay. So another one is counseling on training and educational options. What that is educationally talking with high school students about what's next after high school. Now note that this does not have to be a 4-year college. This can be a 2-year college. This can be vocational school. This can be on-the-job training. And it's also talking with students about what education is required for jobs that they're interested in. This is important because in Virginia, there's different types of diplomas in high school. So it's important to discuss this and what type of high school diploma is acceptable for what you're interested in. Workplace readiness training. This is really important. It's especially important for some of my students that I've worked with either on the spectrum or some that are within the Department of Juvenile Justice. Teaching them about interview skills, teaching them about social skills for the workplace is a huge one. Sometimes learning about employment rights is also really big in this area. I have students who say to me, you know, are they going to hire me if I have a disability? And they need to start learning about employment rights and what rights they have as a person who has a disability, and other skills that might be. So this is where I usually, and doing Zoom is difficult, but what other skills do you all think would be important for learning in the workplace? And you can just chime in if you think of a skill that might be something that's important. Maybe learning about time management, learning about, you what?
Organization.
Yep, organization is a big one. That's something that I struggled with after my brain injury, that I had to reteach myself a lot of different things, and organization was definitely one of them.
Time management.
Time management is huge. Yeah. Computer skills. Computer skills is another big one. Sometimes as they're graduating high school, they still don't have all of the technology skills that they need for the workplace. I have some of my students who are getting certificates while they're still in high school. PREETs is helping to help them get certification in technologies. So the last one is instruction and self-advocacy. And that can include lots of different things. So it can include what types of advocacy skills that people may need in the workplace, how to advocate for accommodations without making it a hostile conversation. It can include how to advocate for accommodations in higher education. It can include advocating independent living skills. Many of my students that I'm working with right now need to learn budgeting skills, and that's included. All of them want to learn how to drive, and that's also included in this kind of activities of daily living, either learning to drive or learning to maneuver the public transportation system. So as I said, often independent living skills are grouped here or in workplace readiness, one or the other. This can also, and this includes, this is a lot of young people that I'm working with right now, it includes advocating for healthcare needs. And that can be really, really important because I have some students who have very low energy due to immunodeficiency, and they have to advocate for themselves and say, you know, I only have enough energy for certain things. Now, I thought there was one more on here. It's not. Okay. So the last one that I thought was on there is talking about interest and what careers you're interested in. And they do what they call career interest inventories with you to determine what you're interested in and what your strengths are, what you may need a little bit more help in. And one important thing to realize with pre-employment transition services, especially within Virginia, is that now that a lot of schools are closed, these services are supposed to be happening online. They are supposed to be happening through Zoom or through Google Chat or in some way virtually. So if you are a parent of a high school student and these services are not happening, or if you are a client of VR and these things are not happening, and you live in Virginia, definitely please call us. If you live in another state, I can connect you with the right protection and advocacy office to call, because these things should still be happening virtually. So when can you start receiving VR services? We just talked about when you're a youth and high school, services can start as early as age 14 and continue until you finish high school. If you attend school after high school, like college, sometimes you can still receive pre-eds as long as you're a student. We recommend asking to be transferred from pre-employment transition services to adult VR as early as possible, because this can sometimes take a little bit of time. So if you're an individual that has a disability that you think may impact you getting a job, we recommend you start talking with, if you're in high school, we recommend you start talking with your counselor as early as possible. If you think that disability might still affect you getting a job, keeping a job, or progressing in a job. So if you're interested, you can contact ours at 804-662-7000. That's their Virginia-wide office. DBVI, you can call it 804-371-3151. If you're participating from a different state, Libby and Stephanie both have my email address. You can contact me and I'll try to help you find the office that will serve you. So let's talk a little bit about assistive technology. This is the fun part. This is where a lot of people learn a lot more and have fun with seeing the different types of AT. So for assistive technology, we're going to cover basically what it is, the types, and where you can find it or find grants for it. So what is assistive technology? Assistive technology can be, a lot of times when people think of AT, they think of things that are high tech, like computers or iPads. It can be any tool that helps a person in daily life. We can't do this right now. It can be bought off the shelf, or it can be customized to each person. It can be handmade, it can be high tech, or it can be low tech. I do have a couple of examples. My first example, this is an example that I had someone show me, and it really changed the way I thought of AT. The light helps a person see. A light can be assistive technology. So I'm going to start with low tech, and then I'll go up to higher tech. So we had an individual call us who could not get into her apartment, and she was going to be kicked out of her apartment because she couldn't make the key work at her apartment. This is a pretty simple solution. This is called an adapted key. And what you do is you stick a regular key into this. You connect the dots, you close it, and then you have a larger surface area to turn a key. This is something I use myself at my own apartment sometimes if my hands start acting up on me. You can buy about 2 of them for $5 or $10 on Amazon. They are a little difficult to open, so just work with it. This is one that I'm pretty sure people have seen before. This is an adapted plate with higher up walls, and an adapted bowl with a larger lip, and adapted silverware that is weighted and also kind of ergodynamic. And people always say, well, it moves around. What do I do when it moves around? You go to a regular like Dollar Tree, and you can get that stuff that makes carpets not move. Put it down on the plate. Less moving. Pretty cool one. So this is playing cards. They are large print. And if you look really close, they also have Braille on them, so that people who are blind can still feel what the card is. And this is just a regular adapted card holder that if people have motor issues holding cards, they can use something like this. This is actually pretty cool. This is just a regular pill box, but what's kind of cool about it is it does have Braille on it if an individual cannot see. What other people like about it is if you only want to take pills for one day, you can take the Sunday and not take the whole week with you. So these are all examples of low tech. I think some that most people have seen is large print. If you are in school, if you have a child in school that needs large print, school systems should be buying large print or supplying large print for your child. You should not be having to do that on your own, and you can advocate through the school system for that. This is just a magnifying glass, just to make things a little bit bigger. Level up, but still not the highest tech. This is picture exchange communication system. And what this is I put mine in a binder. If a person has a picture of what they want, if they want a glass of water, they can peel it out of the book and they can go and give it to the person that they're with to show them what they want. But this is the talking thermostat, so that if people have a hard time seeing what the temperature is, they can push the button and it will tell them what the temperature is outside. A little bit more high tech. This is called a Go Talk. And what this is it's very portable. Let me unplug my headphones. You guys can actually hear. This is a Go Talk that I use for transition all the time. So a student can say, I like books. I want to be a librarian. And what you do is you record your own voice saying these things, and you can print off pictures that will show pictures of that thing, so that if they can't read, they see the picture and they know what to click. But if they can read, they can see the picture and the symbol. So this is our iPad. But oftentimes people don't understand how much it can do. I use the iPad all the time as a communication device for some of my clients. So this is just an example of one of my clients who has some sensory needs. So he can use the iPad to introduce himself. Basically, he can say his name, he can ask for help, he can say that he can't hear, he can ask for a break, he can ask, socialize and ask friends to play tag. Do you want to play tag? He can ask for his favorite, he can ask people what their favorite food is. What's your favorite food? And he can also advocate for himself. It's too loud. By telling people that it's too loud. This is for an older student who can't communicate or has difficulty communicating. If he hurts himself, he can say, and tell people what he needs done. The cool thing with this device is I had a student who he'd never spoken for himself before. He had never had that chance. And we brought him an iPad. We don't supply assistive technology. He was still in school, so the school had to supply it. But we brought the an example of assistive technology to him. And the day he pressed that button and heard a voice that sounded like him, communicating and expressing for him, he just started touching his mouth because that's all he wanted and that's all he could imagine himself hearing like. So we really were able to give him that chance. Other things on the iPad, I use it often as a sensory tool. These are all free, I think. This one's called Fluidity, where if you touch the screen, you can see the light, and it tracks light and helps with sensory. Then social stories. Social stories. Social skills. Stop it. So this is a social stories app where you can create your own social stories. This is one I created for a student with autism. On Friday, I have to go to a big meeting at my school where it prepares him for an IEP meeting. Class early to go to my meeting. And it prepares him for the day, it prepares him for what's going to be talked about so that he's less anxious when he goes to that meeting. And he actually had the story on his iPad when he went to the meeting and followed along with the story so that he knew what was going on. So how can you get assistive technology? There's lots of different ways. There are waivers in the community that you might be eligible for that might be able to help you fund for certain assistive technology. If you are a child in school or a parent of a child in school and thinks that your student might benefit from assistive technology, I strongly recommend you ask your 504 team or your IEP team to discuss assistive technology and make sure that that process is happening. If you are an adult and you are a client of DARS or DBVI, like we talked about, sometimes they can provide for assistive technology if it meets your work goal and you meet the eligibility requirements for that. There are financial eligibility requirements for that they have to have their own paperwork filled out for that. There are also grants in the community that you can apply for. I can send some examples after the presentation on that. So if you have any questions, I will be here after the presentation to answer questions. If you have questions or you want to speak with an advocate, you can call the Disability Law Center of Virginia at 804-225-2042 or 1-800-552-3962 on Mondays, Wednesdays, or Fridays from 8:30 a.m. until 4 p.m. If you are a resident in Virginia. If you are a resident in a different state, there is a protection and advocacy office that serves your state. Just contact me over email and I can try to connect you with that office. If you're in Virginia, you can also submit a request online at www.dlcv.org/gethelp. As we talked about, our client assistance program makes it so that we can advocate for Virginians who have disabilities and are not receiving VR. or not satisfied with the vocational rehabilitation that they are receiving. So I want to thank you guys for your attention and your time, and I am here to answer any questions that you have.